Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our introductory conversation with Saturday Soul. Today, we'll be having a conversation about unfinished business. I'm Chelsea Burrows. We also have two others that will be with us, Dr. Sydney Freeman and Ronnie Vanderhorst. How you guys doing today?
Hey, I'm still the undisputed happiest man in the world.
It's
I'm d-
always a
I'm
good
doing
thing.
good.
Always a good thing. So good to have everybody with us for our first Saturday Soul. So I
Yes.
love like the whole idea about being able to have conversations like we usually do around potluck or hanging out with family and friends. And so I'm excited about this conversation about unfinished business. So let's get right into it. So when we talk about unfinished business, it's like we look around and as a collective, it's like we see that certain things have been done, but then we also see that it feels like there's so much more to do. So, like, tell me what you think. What do you feel like got us to this point, and what does that mean to you for unfinished business?
Well, as a boomer, I hope that's not a despised term. It shouldn't be because of the foundation and groundwork
Mm.
that my generation, the boomer generation, has set, that the subsequent generations are able to stand up on our shoulders. And it's not about trying to take credit for everything, but it's just the truth, the fact that, you know, during the civil rights movement, human rights movement, a lot of things that went on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s when I was growing up, we saw a lot of work that was done. We saw a lot of accomplishments that were done as it pertained in the political realm, as it was in the social realm, as it was basically holistically. And so, boomers, we can kind of pat ourselves on the back, at least for some of the things that were accomplished and that are still continuing as foundational concepts and constructs for us as a people. However, it is my belief, and this title is excellent, that there is still unfinished business.
Yeah.
There's still more work to do. And I'll give just one example, and I'll pick up more in our conversation. But as it pertained to the time when the civil rights movement was going on, Dr. Claude Anderson said in his book, Black Labor, White Wealth, he said that probably one of the biggest faux pas or the biggest problems of the civil rights movement with Dr. King and other persons was that there was no economic plan.
That's real.
And so therefore that was a serious fault or a serious overlooking because King in that era was hoping on the goodwill of whites to be able to find justice and equity as it pertains to economics and so forth. So that is definitely an area of unfinished business that I believe we have to discuss and deal with it moving forward.
Yeah, I would like to kind of build off of that. When I think about unfinished business, and I as much as I can be critical of the boomers. I We do stand on the shoulders
Mhm.
of the boomers. I think one of the challenges that we had when we're talking about maybe Dr. King and others uh, is that notion that Dr. King talked about integrating into a burning house, and it feels like the focus was on integration and partnering with our white brothers and sisters, and it wasn't about necessarily building up what we already had established. And so, Minister Vanderhorst talks a lot about this notion of sovereignty, but I think that's kind of the next frontier of where we're going is to kind of think about building our own capacity, building our own businesses and being entrepreneurial, and we see that going on, and a questioning that's happening. If you're on Seventh Day Adventist Facebook feeds and things like that, you'll see that this week there was jokes going on about us starting our own denomination and things like that. And so there's been some discussions kind of in a joking way, but then there's been some serious conversations even this week where ordained pastors in our church currently pastoring are asking if we should be stepping away. So there is some unfinished business with regards to that. But I was also pushed to this week in light of the conversation that was going on because of the Black Church documentary by Skip Gates, this whole idea of the inclusion of women and other marginalized individuals in our churches that have been pushed to the side in many ways, or we've not fully heard their voices. And so I think a part of the unfinished work that we have to do and the unfinished business that we have to attend to is ensuring that even if we are to come together as Black people, that we are equitable across difference and that we hear from different people around the table.
That's interesting that you mentioned that last part, because I know that and talking like and common things, there's been kind of a schism between those who are African American, those who are of Caribbean descent, those are from the continent, those who are from Afro-Latinidad and other areas across the world. And it's like you're mentioning that unfinished business looks like collaboration amongst all, which I think for some people they might have a hard time with that, because there's commonality and then there's difference that's there as well. Like, what do you think?
Well, if I could, okay.
Please.
Okay, so I think that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So there's some things that African Americans, I'm an American descendant of slaves, and so we really have to have a conversation amongst us. There's a group that wants to really push for reparations and what that looks like, and what does that look like in organizations that we've invested in. So denominational structures where we've invested a lot of resources. There's a question of, should there be reparations from those denominational structures? There's questions about our institutions, right? So our institutions, educational institutions, should there be reparations from institutions like American University and Harvard and others? Because most of those institutions, they were built on the backs of slaves, right? And so there's a conversation amongst Black Americans, as some would call, but then there's conversations that has to be had amongst those within other parts of the diaspora. But then there's a collective conversation that we have to have amongst each other across the diaspora. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's a both and. So I push against, even though I am supportive of what we call the ADOS movement, I am also open enough to see that there's some things that we need to do as it relates to maybe Pan-African, some of the thoughts around that, for us to kind of work together collaboratively. So rather than thinking about that, from you have to be just ADOS or you have to be Pan-African. I think both are needed for us to be free and to move forward.
In addition to what Dr. Freeman has just said, I am a firm believer that it is quintessential for us as Africans in America to firm our base before we broaden it.
That's real.
And so there are a lot of conversations. There are a lot of areas of unfinished business that do pertain to us as Africans in America, Blacks in America, even with the diverse cultural contexts. However, as Black people, we need to be be able to look at our own selves, our own challenges. We need to look at the gaps.
Yeah.
We need to be able to look at areas of specificity that we can start with. You know, it's almost like a process of elimination that you handle those things that are, and I say this very loosely, easiest to deal with first. It's almost like many of you know in college taking a test. You deal with all of the questions in the test that you already know that's easier. So you spend your time on that real hard question, and then the time is up and you never get to finish your test. So we need to prioritize and actually, you know, in a mindset of consensus to be able to see what things can be done, what can be addressed, what may be more time sensitive. And then as we look at these other areas of unfinished business, we know that they are on the table, but they may not necessarily be the priority at this time.
So you make me ask a question then. What then are some of the challenges that we can tangibly deal with that's most easy? You know what I mean? So what would be a tangible step one that is within reach right now, regardless of generation and location, and like what could be the first thing that people could start to do to move things forward so that unfinished business becomes just that, finished?
Well, I would jump in and say some things that we've been advocating on this platform, which is to decolonize your mind. So everything first starts with your mind, right? And so I think if for all the things that we want to do, if your mind is not right, if you've not been reading, if you've not been engaging, then you're going to have some challenges moving forward in the process of getting to something like sovereignty, right? So I think the first step is individually working on yourself, knowing who you are and whose you are. And then from there, you can engage a broader group on next steps moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about this for a very long time because all of the priorities are step one. They really are. And so we could either do eeny, meeny, miny, mo, or, you know, fling, flying, flew, whatever however we used to do as children growing up. But this is one I really believe is a beginning step as it pertains to unfinished business. And I say this in all honesty and sincerity. I believe that my boomer generation needs to have listening sessions with millennials, Gen X, Y, Z, subsequent generations. We need to have listening sessions. You know, Covey says something that is important. He said, seek first to understand and then to be understood.
Right.
And so often in our dialogues, engagement, interaction, parenting, or whatever, we may be so busy trying to be understood that we don't seek first to understand. So having listening sessions, providing, like for Saturday Soul, which is, you know, under the liberation movement, to facilitate listening sessions where my generation, boomers, we can listen to the subsequent generations as to what do they think we need to understand, what we need to know. And coupled with those listening sessions, I do believe that there is unfinished business as it pertains to my generation, boomers, not willingly handing over the baton, so to speak, to subsequent generations also. The baton of leadership, the baton of vision casting and visioning, the baton of the education of Black children in a more contemporary and updated understanding. Your generations are the most credentialed generations ever. And it's not that my boomer generation is not credentialed or has nothing to offer, but we are in a different time and space. We don't have the energy anymore.
Yeah.
But we can definitely be what I call pro-visionaries, so that when you have a vision, then we make provision that your visions might be realized. I think that those are two essential steps to begin with. And that definitely is the listening sessions as well as the passing of the baton.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting that you say that, because my experience largely has been where those who are more senior are the ones that are heard. And so those that have that experience should be the ones listened to, rather than the other way around. And I think what you're saying is very true, but I think it's going to take a certain level of humility for your generation to be able to understand that there are things in terms of experience that our generation and those that are subsequent, we have a means of contribution that the boomer generation has not been able to really have firsthand experience with. They're going to have those things explained to them to have some perspective. And you kind of hit on something that I think is interesting, that I don't think a lot of boomers or very many even of the greatest generation even think about, but the blind spots. Like, I know that in your generation, there are specific things that you and those of your era are familiar with when it comes to civil rights, and even, you know, those before that, the things that they were familiar with. But there are things that are now that you know, we experience that are just totally different from that type of experience. The blind spots, I think, are going to be an area that if we don't focus on to be able to resolve, then we're kind of, it's an uphill battle already, but it's going to be insult upon injury or challenge upon challenge to be able to circumvent. Those blind spots, I think, could really help, you know, getting clear on them so that we can be more united and clear on where, you know, the direction that we're wanting to go.
Chelsea, I want to build on both what you said and Minister Vanderhorst has said. I remember watching an interview with the Reverend Al Sharpton, and it was talking about passing the baton to the Black Lives Matter movement in our generation. And he said, well, rip it out of my hands, right? He said, rip the baton out of my hands. He said, Jesse Jackson didn't pass the baton to me. I had to rip it out of his hands. You hear Andy Young had a similar interview, and he said that we had to rip it out of the hands of the ones before him, Thurgood Marshall and others. Thurgood Marshall, it was interesting watching an interview where they said Thurgood Marshall was critical of MLK and others. So the way that we're taught is that you know, Frederick Douglass on down, everyone was just, you know, from generation to generation, everybody agreed. That's not necessarily the case. No. And it's not necessarily that the baton was passed. And I think that's just a dysfunctional challenge that we have. And it's not just us, other communities have that, but it's very detrimental to us, right? We can't afford to not pass the baton and things like that. And so it can't just, one thing that I would say, it just can't be your blood that you pass the baton down to. Mm-hmm. So there's times where Jesse Jackson Sr. is going to pass it down to Jesse Jackson Jr. rather than saying, I'm invested in the next generation of activists, period. Right. And so if my son happens to be the one, great. Right. But I want to pass that along to those who I believe have the potential to make things happen. And so I think that's a part of the new frontier that we have to be moving towards.
Yeah.
Right. And to just add this in is, I believe that we have to go with who wants to go.
Yeah.
There were those who had unfortunately gotten comfortable on the plantation, their state of normalcy, and they didn't want to venture out.
Yeah.
So they stayed there. But you had the resistors, the agitators, those who would risk to make movement. And I believe your generations can see and hear from my boomer generation, who are the accommodists, who just want to stay and keep things in place, and who are the resistors,
right?
The ones who want to make movement, to support you and to pass the baton, and you just have to go with who you got to go with.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to leave those who want to stay where they actually are.
Yeah.
Can I, if I can just jump on that? One of the big, I was on Clubhouse last week, and it was a whole conversation on Clubhouse about the Black Church documentary, and there was this critique of this messianic leadership and personality-driven leadership in the black movement over time, right? And so one of the things that I think we're going to have to struggle with, right, is as we could see with the Black Lives Matter movement, we had 3 queer women who led the movement, and there wasn't one that was kind of like, I am the leader, right? And so for many of us in the church, because of the way the church is structured, that we have a male pastor at the top, and in denominational structures, we have a president, all those kinds of things. We're looking for certain people, particularly those who are great orators, right, to be this messianic Moses for us, to lead us to the next place. The question that we're going to have to struggle with is, are we just looking for this great orator, this great person to tell us where we're going next, versus doing the work ourselves and working together, as Minister Vanderhorst is alluding to, that I believe he's alluding to, that we do our own work, and work with those who are about the business of moving forward. Not just, well, this person's, I like this person, but this person is still connected to the field. They want to stay in the field, right? You got to kind of, or they want to stay in the house. They're not trying to build their own house. So the people, you got to roll with the people that want to build their own house. So that's kind of, I think that's kind of some of the things that we need to be thinking about moving forward.
Chelsea, I know we have to shift gears, but there is a historical precedent.
Oh, no, we're good.
And just what Dr. Freeman says. Let me just give the listeners just a little history, exactly what he said. Ella Baker, Sister Ella Baker, was one of the co-founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Movement with Dr. King and others. She suggested something to them that was completely rejected from male dominance and male privilege and patriarchy. She says, listen, when we have a leader-centered group, if the leader is picked off and assassinated, then usually the movement is gone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ella Baker introduced to them, she said, we do not need a leader-centered group. What we need is a group-centered leadership.
Yes.
Consensus. So they can't really take the leader out, so to speak. They rejected what she said. Ella Baker left the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She moved to Harlem, New York, and if anybody reads her history, the rest is history for her. She started working with youth and I mean, did an incredible work, but they had an opportunity for a group-centered leadership. This is what we are talking about, basically moving forward, where this model will be different from this male patriarchal, misogynist, whatever, kind of leadership moving forward with these subsequent generations.
Yeah. But I mean, I think about it though, like if we look at our situation, like both in terms of the Christian perspective as well as the Black perspective, this doesn't have to be some crabs in a barrel type situation. It just doesn't. It can be something that is collaborative, that is inclusive, that does allow for people who, even within our own group of people, are more marginalized, that have a voice to be able to take up the things that are important and keep moving. I mean, we look at this. We are being able to connect and talk with people literally around the world. Why would we want to be able to center in on one person being the face or the front of whatever the mission and the mantra is for our change? That's limiting. We are literally putting shackles on ourselves of what we want to be able to actually do and reach. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, one young lady that I kind of posed this question to, she said that one, there's ego, and then there's two, there is a natural desire to have a leader. If we go back to the Bible, we can think about King Saul and how he emerged as king, because the people wanted a king. Yeah. And so I think as we build our movements, we have to do that. We have to be intentional. It has to be intentional to make sure that it's collaborative and it is integrative and has other people at the table. I remember when over the last few months, there was this whole discussion about flyers, when pastors would post flyers online about different programs that they were putting on, and they would say, well, we don't know any women that speak to this particular topic. And so one of the things that I would share with them is that I would start with women first.
Yes.
I would say, who are the women who can speak to this? And then I know, because there are more men on these types of platforms, that we can find men, but I have to intentionally start with women, start with those who are most marginalized, right? And then incorporate those who are mostly represented already. And so I think there are these different strategies that we have to think about so we can be intentional about being inclusive of all voices.
Right.
I'm seriously honest about the root of this. And that is, from enslavement, many Black males in leadership operate off of a de facto slaveholder model.
Well, yeah.
As it pertains to patriarchy and leadership and male ideology and privilege. It is de facto slaveholder mindset in Black.
You doing something now? No, you want to go down there? You want to go down there? I'm just saying. You can keep going.
The whole institutional construct.
Yes.
Is basic. And I committed myself. I probably was going to say this a little later on, but I'll say it right now. I committed myself in my life in 2021. If I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about sexism too. I'm not going to deal with racism without dealing with sexism as it pertains to Black women.
Yeah.
It is just as deleterious, just as dehumanizing, just as detrimental, and just as deadly. And there is no way. I mean, on Facebook, I'll post some things. I've been pitching some stuff, trying to give Black pastors and Black male leadership, something to run with. How many of you are dealing with sexism in your church? Is it on your agenda this year? I'm crickets, straight up crickets. And maybe it's because of me. Sometimes, the voice or the mouthpiece is the one that is conveniently rejected. So I'm not
No.
at all, you see. But it's like Yahshua Messiah says, okay, if you don't want to hear me, then believe the works that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in over 40 years as far as work is concerned, a body of work. I'm not hyping myself. I'm just simply saying I've seen, I've learned, I've understood to be able to look at this religious system, the Black church, so to speak, and especially Blacks who are affiliated memberships with white run congregations.
Right.
And that's another
of
unfinished business. Maybe we need to pivot.
Yeah.
I was about to say. No, go ahead, Sid.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was saying saying this week, I've been having a lot of conversations around the church, is that when Minister Vanderhorst often talks about this notion of sovereignty, it pushes me to think about when I sit at white tables. So I'm a professor, and many times I'm sitting at tables where I'm representing our people. And what you find is that even if you're at the main seat on the table, right? The table is set that is such that even if you want to empower those who are most marginalized, right? The majority of the table has been set by whiteness, right? Yeah. And so you can put,
or maleness.
Yes.
And some of those things are intertwined, right? So in saying that, so you can have Vice President Harris, or you can have President Obama at the head of the table, right? But ultimately, they have to bow to whiteness at the table. And so I think when we apply that to a denominational context, I was talking with my wife about when we vote on who becomes president and things like that, right? And how because even if we want to change the way that we vote for conference presidents in the Seventh-day Adventist context, right? If we wanted to change that, all that is set by how the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists does things, and they set the manual, and then the North American Division and all those things. And the first thing people would say is that if you tried to change the voting structure, the first thing they would say is that, well, we would not be in compliance with the higher levels in the way that they do it. So we've been laughing and joking about the Kojic Church and the AME Church, where they're actually having people are running for office, right? But at least if you run for office within their system, you can have a platform, right? You can have. So what we do in our particular denominational context is that we base it on, we don't know. A lot of the people, we don't even know what their platform is. The president, what his platform is. It's just that he may have come to my church, I've heard him preach, and that's what I'm familiar with. But it's no platform, no necessarily can provide a vision for the future of that particular conference, and they can't. And they're not changing the system. So even if more people would vote for another person, the way that it's structured is that one person gets nominated, right? And if you go to the floor and that person gets a whole bunch of votes, then whoever else, that's it. So, which is what I would believe if we had our own separate structure, that it would not look like that, because I'm seeing other examples of other Black run denominational structures that are operating differently.
I'll say this. I don't care who's in leadership. If their goal is to liberate people, specifically people of color, specifically Black people, then I'm willing to have more of a conversation, because that has not been the focus. That is the unfinished business, being able to liberate people, because we are not liberated right now, both in mind and in thought and in action. So if we're not going to have those conversations for whomever is in leadership, then quite frankly, I don't want to have this conversation at all. To me, it's a moot point. What are we doing? What are we doing? Let's move towards liberation. Let's move towards people who have been notoriously marginalized, being able to give them a voice, like we've talked about before. If that can't happen, then to me, we're wasting time. And I don't like doing that.
I know you don't like to waste time, Chelsea, at all.
Don't.
But listen, we're looking at a whole systemic dynamic also. It's just like Langston Hughes said back in 1945. He said racism is overt and it is covert. But then he said this, and I'm quoting, all an individual has to do is subscribe to the norms of the institution, and the institution will do the discriminating for them. So also of the institution is not to liberate. It is to discriminate. And then when I was listening to WHUR, Howard University Radio, on the election day, and they were in conversation. One brother in the village said something. I was driving, and he said something that was so deep. It was like, boom! I had to pull over and jot it down. He said, President Joe Biden will not stop or impede racism at all. He said, why? He said, because the office of the presidency of the United States is a racist office.
Foundationally.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
So therefore, we're looking at institutions and the which are part and parcel, especially white-run institutions that Blacks are affiliated with. It's already died in the wool. And that's why back in the 60s and the 70s, the Pan-African movement, brothers and sisters, were talking about nation building, building our own institutions. And so, my thing is I want to purport to Black leadership who are in white-run denominations. What would you rather have, an apartment or your own house? If you have an apartment, then you're going to be limited by somebody who owns that apartment. Sure, you can complain and whine, and they'll give you a little more square feet. They will give you one person in a higher position in their white-run system, and you can applaud and act like, ooh, we're making progress. One person, a president of a division, in an apartment. So it's always going to be limited. Or would you rather have your own house? And that's where I feel that in white-run denominations with Black members, even with Black leadership, the unfinished business is sovereignty.
Gotcha.
Richard Allen came out of the Methodist Church and started the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was sovereign. I'm talking about under a sovereign creator, a sovereign Lord first, and then a sovereign entity, where now you would have people come out the woodwork, Blacks, boomers, who will help finance, who will use their human resources. You will have all of the disgruntled, upset, conscious Black brothers and sisters, subsequent generations, who can see and be foundational in this house of their ownership with, and get this one, with profit sharing. See, that's what tithing, where they can receive remuneration for what we invest into, we can get out of. I was in New York. In fact, and I say this sensitively, Chelsea, for your grandmother's funeral in New York. Allen AME Church. As we drove up on the bus that we had come up with, a group of us, I looked at the Allen Memorial AME homes, apartment buildings, magnificently manicured and kept, where your dad told me that members, it was profit sharing, affordable housing that people could live in and rent and own, that members of that church receive remuneration for that. That's a progressive mindset. You won't get that in the apartment of somebody else who owns it for you. But I believe that, and again, these four things, I'm done on this point. I believe that there's four aspects when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about reshuffling chairs on the deck of the Titanic. That's all they're doing. That either they're going to be crickets from Black leadership, you ain't gonna hear nothing from them, or you'll get apologists who will defend the apartment dwelling of from white-run denominations. Or you will get, as my friend Dr. Jerome Crichton said, you will get persons who are hyper-vigilant, who, as soon as you say something about whites, they get anxiety and they come in to want to try to minimize the anxieties that whites might feel, or to modify their own behaviors so that they don't look so bad in front of whites. Hypervigilance. Or either you get the resistors who say, let's go, let's get our own house so that we can do more in the village, do more for the kingdom.
So can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So some people may ask kind of, what is the biblical basis for this, right? So when we hear sovereignty, they hear that we must be one. We've been socialized that we must be one in Christ, and the Bible says that. And so when they hear sovereignty, they're hearing separation. Is there a biblical basis? Is there a biblical basis for this concept of sovereignty?
Yeah, I think you just hit on it when it talks about there's no Jew or Greek or any like that. That gives some idea in terms of, no, we are one, but we know that in this context in the United States, that is not the case. And so sovereignty is the next thing in terms of a step up to be able to have that oneness actually happen. Does that make sense? Like you can't have a group of people that were enslaved and still to a certain extent live within the slavery type of mindset and not be seen as equal in a church that says that everybody is one. That's not the reality. That is not the case. And if anything, that has to happen in order for people to be able to have equality. And equality by meaning every single person is valued. They have means of contribution. They have means that are heard, that are respected, and that will be used for every group of people that are there. Because if it's not us as Black people, there will be another group of people, another minority group that the dominant culture will push down and oppress in a way that will allow them not to have a voice. So yes, in my opinion, that yeah.
See, that's why we need your generation, Shell. You know, exactly with that perspective. And in addition to that, there is also more scriptural substantiation. It's just very quickly a team. A team is not one person.
Yeah.
You have a quarterback, you have a wide receiver, you have a center. They're one team under one name, but they are a team with individuals, you
Right.
see. But Acts 2 gives us a scriptural substantiation of sovereignty. Individuals who were under a colonizing construct
Yes.
from religious, patriarchal, sexist leadership. When Yahshua Messiah came and brought this group together, when Yahshua Messiah finished his work, they were a sovereign group who brought their own resources together.
Yep.
To make sure that everybody that they dealt with was taken care of. They were not under that construct. When that veil was ripped from top to bottom, showing that this was a supernatural act, not from any humans, for that veil was 30 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 4 inches thick, which meant that no individual could tear that veil.
Right.
But when that veil toward giving access to the Father, you see, in that symbolism, when they went under a sovereign movement and got their own house, they did not go back under that old system, as many of them continue to stay there and continue to slit the throats of lambs.
Right. Right.
Yeah. They were sovereign under a sovereign Lord.
Woo!
And they turned the world upside down in less than 30 years.
Right.
Wow.
Oh,
There's
biblical precedent.
Yeah. I want to pivot for a little bit. I and I know I see where things are. So I know that a lot of us in this last year, I think even the making of this group kind of getting together to have conversation came out of what some would say is like an apparent worldwide or American awakening to the plight of Black people, with the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the list unfortunately goes on. So I guess my question is, what does unfinished business look like for the Black liberated mind in terms of the dominant culture? Like what does that look like? Because I think some people would say that they butt heads. I think some people would say that there's no place for it and there has to be a separation or a redefining or a revaluing system that's set in place. But this spiritual awakening, or this awakening to the plight of Black people, when it comes to unfinished business with the dominant culture, that right now we can't circumvent, we can't go around, it's here. Yeah.
Well, I can just talk about kind of my experience, and I know others may have had different experiences with this awakening. So the way that I was socialized was that people would say something to the effect that your ethnic and racial culture did not supersede Jesus Christ and your relationship with him. So in many ways, they would be if we talked about social justice or our Blackness, we would quickly pivot. There would be a quick pivot to say that you got to put God first. God is, above all. And so over time, I had the opportunity, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, to go to Trinity United church in Chicago, and then I also had a chance to go to Saint Sabina Catholic Church in Chicago, and so those are churches that are unashamedly and unapologetically Black, right? And so I began in my own study in the Word of God, coming to the conclusion that those things are not diametrically opposed. Any theological perspective that applies to me must also, those things must be integrated. And so from my perspective, those things don't bump heads. It is integrated. And so over the last few years, when as things have evolved, I've had more questions. And so when establishing the liberation movement, it was actually asking some of these, the idea was to ask some of these questions. Were there others that had similar feelings, and where are we going from here? And so that was a part of my evolution and motivation and moving forward with this type of ministry.
Mm-hmm.
There are two things that come to mind for me. Number one is that Brother Malcolm X said that it is not the Black person's responsibility to change white people. White people should go to their own people and work on the change. That's what he said. In direct response to your question, what comes into my spirit is this, is that I believe that the Black assignment, not only to the world, but to power, to the powerless, or to dominating cultures, is truth telling. That's the mission. And truth seekers, no matter who they are, will gravitate to truth tellers. So it's not about trying to change anybody's mind, anybody's political or social ideologies, none of that. It's about truth telling. And Yahshua Messiah said, the truth will make us free, no matter who you are or what affiliation you belong to. That truth might mean that you might have to get up out of that. But the truth telling is unfinished business.
Yeah. Yep.
As it pertains to Blacks in America, which has been relegated to whatever degree to a religious sector, not necessarily to a social sector or to an economic sector or to a social justice sector or whatever else. And truth telling from different spheres and realities of life can assist anybody, any place, at any time. And I believe that the Black collective needs to wake up and come up even in the areas of your profession, vocation, specificity, to become a truth teller.
Yeah.
In the venues of influence that you have or that you are a part of.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I know a lot of different groups, mine included, have allowed for platforms and for conversations like this to happen. It's specifically at work, which I don't think was, outside of Black History Month, was something that happened quite often. So I'm interested to see, how that can continue. But I will say this, we're out of time. We're out of time for this conversation. And so I know that there's so much more to be able to talk about. So we're gonna continue this conversation after this. But wanted to be able to let everybody know, you can follow us on social media. We both have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We're also going to be, like I said, on Clubhouse afterwards. So we do have another event that's coming that will be more of a conversation like this as it pertains to liberating the person's mind. For one of our members who actually is Jacinth Theodore, she has a background in mental health, and so she'll be sharing with us the emotionally corrective experience on March 27th. So please look forward to having you guys come and share that experience with us at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But do know that we are not finished with this conversation. It is not over. We will be meeting immediately after on Clubhouse. For those who aren't familiar, it is a new social media platform. Myself, Janelle Phillip, and Dr. Sydney Freeman we have to continue this conversation. Unfinished business means that there's more to do. There are things that have to be done, and discussions help that happen. And so please join us. I'm excited to be able to see more of what this conversation would look like. I can't thank the two of you enough for your insights and the blessing of this conversation, because it's needed and the time is now.
All right. Well, looking forward to jumping on Clubhouse in a few moments to continue the conversation.
All right, guys. See you in a little bit.
All right.